Now, if you're visiting with us, we are making our way through the book of Mark week by week. We took a little bit of a detour last week to learn about Round Lake Christian Camp, and if you didn't notice in the bulletin, raised a little over $1,600 for the camp, which we're very excited about. But as we work our way through Mark, we'll take a different approach week to week, depending on which chapter we're in and what comes to mind for me. Some weeks we might just take one little story out of the chapter and try to develop something from that. And this week, a little bit differently in Mark chapter 3, I was struck reading through the chapter. And I'd encourage you to do the same thing maybe as you read through a chapter of Scripture, to look for things that you see that are similarities. And as I looked through this third chapter of Mark, I noticed that a few places throughout that chapter we have the phrase looking for or seeking or watching, something along those lines. And depending on the version you use, I think it was the ESV, used looking in all of them. And even though it meant something slightly different as to how we look, as to whether it's just we're observing something or we're seeking something out, I was struck by at the beginning in verse 2 and at the end of verse 32, this idea of looking. And it made me wonder for us, what is it that we seek? And I thought we'd look as we go through the chapter here at what each group that Jesus encounters, what they're seeking, and then maybe put some ideas together at the end about what he seeks and what we should be seeking. Another time, beginning in verse 1, Jesus went into the synagogue and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or evil, to save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians about how they might kill Jesus. They were looking for in Jesus a mistake. They wanted to see him slip up. They wanted to see him do something that they could catch him in. They wanted to find a problem with him. And I think a lot of us go through days feeling this way. I was getting onto the Delta Highway yesterday, and right behind me was a Eugene police officer getting onto the Delta Highway. And I found myself, even though I'm doing everything I'm supposed to do in a car, I kept glancing in that mirror, and I kept thinking, is he still there? Yeah, he's still there, okay. And I'm trying to drive casually, I don't know. And as I go along, I think to myself, he doesn't probably even know, he's not even thinking about me. He's talking on his Bluetooth, he's on his way somewhere for a call, he's coming back from donuts, he's a police officer. Whatever it is he's doing, he's probably not considering me at all, and yet here I am assuming that this guy behind me is waiting for me to signal, wait a couple seconds, change lanes. I'm going through all the motions the way I should be doing things. For Jesus, as he looked over his shoulder, as he watched these people, it was real. He constantly was followed around by a group of people that was just waiting for him to trip up. And not just waiting for him to trip up in the way some might wait for it with us, where they want to give you the "I told you so," or they want to just, laugh or whatever it may be. These people have power where they could make things very difficult on him. And in the end, they're looking for his death. That's their end goal. And so these folks, they come to something that should be amazing. Here's this man with the issue with his hand, and then he is healed, and instead, they just watch step by step to see what is wrong with things. Now, for us, I hope as we look at these, we can look at ourselves a little bit too. What are we looking for when we go into a situation? Are we looking for the best in people? Are we assuming that things are going to be good, or are we waiting for someone to make a mistake? There's a game later today, if you've not heard. There are commercials and all of those things. There is a team playing in the game later today that has had a lot of success over the last decade or so. And I guarantee you that there are a group of people, maybe some of us here, who will watch this game and just wait for that team to mess up. Because we want to see the other team win, so that team doesn't win again, because that gets boring and old and we don't like that and they're not our team. I like to think we just do that on the big game Sunday, but in reality, we tend to do that in life sometimes, where we run into people, and for whatever reason, we are just looking for them to fail. We're looking for them to mess up. And unfortunately, there are probably people that are doing the same for us. What if we could be in the midst of this group who is watching Jesus and be the one person to say, while we're all looking for the mistake, we're all looking for the problem, you notice he just healed a guy, right? You notice there was a guy who had a physical problem that no one could do anything about, and now that guy is whole. Shouldn't we be just a little bit amazed by that? And this would be the beginning of how we change how we look at people, how we look at life. Continuing on, Jesus withdrew from his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. When they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. Because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding him. For he had healed many, so those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Whenever the impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him. This crowd, as they approach, what they're all looking for is healing. Or maybe to see something amazing, or maybe some combination of those two things. But the first group Jesus encounters that we looked at, they're looking for a mistake. They want him to mess up. The second group, they want something. They have come to him for something that he can do for them. And I would also submit to you that we probably have some of these friends as well. People that you have something that they do not have, you have something that they cannot have on their own, and they come to you to use you for that thing. I've been guilty of this in the past myself. A friend of mine and I joke about it now. I have a good friend, Thad Bartlett. Thad lives in Atlanta, Georgia now. We went to school together from 1st to the 12th grade. I was in Thad's wedding. I can't remember if he's in mine or not, but he was a good friend. Thad had a pool. In Mobile, Alabama in the summertime, it was good to know somebody with a pool. And so I liked Thad, and Thad liked me, and we got along fine. But the fact that Thad had a pool brought things to a whole nother level. And I think somewhere along the way, Thad realized, we always go to my house instead of your house. What's up with that? And I think I finally just said, well, Thad, there's no pool at my house. Come on, man. And we started to realize that part of this relationship was the pool. Jesus, as he is followed around, there are a lot of people that see him for what he can do for them. And it's easy for us, by the way, as Christians to get in that same mode. The idea of salvation, the idea of eternal life, the idea of what he brings for us is very attractive to us. But what he wants in return is something for us in our lives, something different about how we're going to live. And so let's not just go to him for the thing that he gives us, as this crowd does. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called those to him he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, James, John, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. And now you have this group of 12, and Jesus wants something from them, but they also want something from him. And what they're looking for is a rabbi. They want someone to lead them. They want someone to teach them. They want someone to add meaning to their lives. And Jesus is very willing to provide all those things. And in exchange, what Jesus is looking for is to multiply his efforts. Because although he knows, realistically, he could be everybody everywhere at once. He's the Son of God. He's divine. And yet he understands that part of the way he's going to do his ministry is through these people. They're going to multiply his effort. So as they look for something and he looks for something, this relationship that builds between them actually benefits each of them in a different way. They need leadership. They need someone who is going to direct them, and he's willing to do that. And then we find this last group. Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." Now you remember back on Christmas when Cheyenne was baptized, we talked about the birth of Christ. The week before that, we talked about these announcements that came from angels. And although his parents knew who he was going to be, I would imagine seeing this reality happen in front of you is something entirely different than hearing it from the angel. Now, more so than that, put yourself in the shoes of the sibling for just a minute. How would you feel about the sibling out there saying that they are the Son of God? How would you feel about the sibling that is doing all these things? How would you feel about the sibling putting himself in a place where his life is in danger? And his family doesn't know what to do with this. So they say he's out of his mind. The teachers of the law came down from Jerusalem and said, he's possessed by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, is why he's driving out demons. So Jesus called them over to him and began to speak to them in parables and said, how can Satan drive out Satan? Which is a pretty good question. It doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense, the answer they've come to. If a kingdom is divided against itself, then the kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand. His end has come. In fact, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house. Truly, I tell you, people can be forgiven all their sins and every slander they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. They are guilty of an eternal sin. Then Jesus' mother and brother arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was gathering around him, and they told him, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. And what are his mother and brothers looking for besides just him? They're looking for him to fit into the spot where he's supposed to be in the family. Because what he's doing is not that spot in their minds. And I think a lot of us have probably been victim of something like this along the way. I think of my wife. My wife is an accounting professor. I remember being at her family home for Christmas one year, and 3 people were having a discussion about accounting with some business that they were doing, and had really no idea what they were talking about as they were going through this thing because they're not accountants. And she just kind of sat to the side, smiling, waiting, wondering. And not once did anyone ever turn Stacy's direction and say, what do you think about this accounting thing we can't figure out? Because she's little Stacy, that spent her summers on the farm and grew up with them, one of the youngest of all the cousins. She's not the accounting wizard. And yet she would come back here to where her students are, and they will call or text or email day or night because they desperately need to learn something to pass the test. And we just kind of laughed at the idea of, with family, sometimes they just don't get it. Sometimes to them, you're still little you instead of fully grown you with the life experience that you bring now. And Jesus fought against that same thing. His family wanted him in a particular spot, and he knew that that was not the place where he could do what he needed to do. And so he responds in this way, which I think starts to let us in a little bit to what it is that Jesus seeks. And that, I hope, is the question that we look through a lot of his stories with. Excuse me. Who are my mother and brothers? He asked. Now, I like questions that Jesus asks, because these folks have just finished telling him, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. And when he says, who are my mother and brothers, there's this piece of you immediately that just wants to say, we just told you that. They're outside. They're looking for you. He says, who are my mother and brothers? And then he looked, and again we find that looked that we found at the beginning of the chapter. He looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. So what is he seeking? What is he looking for? He is looking for whoever does God's will. What is he seeking from us? He's seeking from us that we will do God's will. And what is God's will in our life? Well, that's the tough question. Because for each of us, it's something a little bit different. Now, in its end, I think we can find it here. We know that if we seek him first, that we will find him. We know that if we ask, it will be given to us. We know that he loves us enough that Jesus came for us. And now he seeks in us people who do God's will. So how do we go about that? Well, like we talk about quite a bit in here, it's not just here for an hour on Sundays. We do God's will as we leave here. We do God's will as our team is winning or losing later this afternoon. We do God's will when we interact. We do God's will during our congregational meeting here in a little while. We do God's will at our workplace, within our families. We do God's will wherever we go. And when Jesus is looking and seeking and finds those people, those are the people that he will be very, very pleased with. So the question for us is, what do we seek? When we come to Jesus, like these different groups that he encounters here in chapter 3, what is it that we are looking for? I hope that we don't look at Jesus the way that first group does, waiting for a mistake. For one thing, I think we're going to be very disappointed when he doesn't make one, because that's not who he is. But two, I hope we go into our search for him assuming the positive and realizing that he is the perfect Son of God and is going to do the right thing all the time. Secondly, I hope as we are seeking, that we are seeking as he does also to do God's will. I hope we look at each thing in life and think, well, there is a godly way here and maybe a less godly way here. Which way should I go? And we choose the godly way. I hope part of our seeking out of God's will is we look at that we begin to assume the best, that we're not looking to find fault with our brothers and our sisters, but instead we're looking for ways to encourage and build each other. And this morning, if these are things you struggle with, you are not alone by any means. I think most of us struggle with having our mindsets right. Most of us struggle with somebody, with us having the right attitude. Most of us struggle sometimes with doing the godly thing when there is an easier way to do something. This morning, if you've never taken him on in baptism, if you've never followed him, this would be a great day to do that, and we'd love to see you do that. This morning, if you're part of the family here and there's something that we can pray about, something you need to share with your brothers and sisters, if there's anything we can do at all, please come while we stand and sing.